Gravity. Invented in 1687 by Sir Isaac Newton, this theoretical construct has remained somewhat popular over the past couple hundred days, even being added into several popular video games, one of which being Terraria. And while Newton suggests that gravity should pull objects downwards, or more specifically pulling matter inwards to a central point, what if we were to not only disregard gravity entirely, but flip it on its theoretical head and fall up? Can we still beat Master Mode Terraria given this rather peculiar challenge, or will we, simply put, fall short? Anyway, I hope you'll enjoy, and without any more wasted time, let's get into the video. Upon joining our OK, I kind of forgot I can't actually give a proper introduction to this world since we immediately start flying up into space. Interesting. Okay, so already we've come across the first major problem with this challenge, and that's that as soon as we join the world, we're immediately torn away from the green grass and luscious leaves and thrown straight into the stratosphere where we inevitably die to the ceiling of space. Because, as we all know, space has a ceiling. Now, the worst part about all of this is that respawning, well, it doesn't really do much to help us, seeing as we perpetually fall back up to space where we die over and over and over again. And honestly, it doesn't really appear as though there's anything that we can do, that we're perpetually stuck in this death cycle, and that this is kind of it, that we aren't able to make any progress, right? Well, not exactly. In fact, there's actually two separate ways that we can make progress in this world. The first of which being that if we're incredibly lucky, you might, and the word might is doing a lot of heavy lifting since I'm not even sure if this is even physically possible, but you might have a sky island / sky lake generate close enough to spawn where you can safely land on it, since cloud blocks negate all fall damage. From here, you just need to gather some resources and tower your way back up to the surface and start playing the game from there. Though, unfortunately, this wasn't the case in this world, meaning that we had to resort to Plan B, which is extremely time-consuming and especially mentally taxing. Okay, so you remember how literally a couple sentences ago I said that respawning doesn't really do much to help us since we perpetually fall back up to space where we die over and over and over again? Well, I wouldn't say that I lied about respawning not being all that helpful, since again, we immediately ascend to our zero gravity graves. However, whenever we do respawn, there's a couple frames where we're close enough to the surface to interact with it, whether it be to mine the dirt around us with our pickaxe, or if you're lucky like me, you can chop down a tree with your axe so long as it generates essentially directly on top of your spawn. But again, we only have a couple frames where we can do so, meaning that I could only get a single good swing in with my axe before I had to wait a mind-numbingly, excruciatingly long 15.5 seconds to fall to my death, not to mention having to wait an entire 15 more seconds just to respawn, just to, get this, get a single swing in on the tree with my copper axe, a tool that's already well renowned for being extremely slow in a normal run where gravity is universally recognized as a law. Now, I pride myself for being a somewhat patient person. I mean, I would expect myself to be patient considering the fact that I completed a world essentially without a world, but having to wait a whole 30 seconds just to hit a tree a singular time was really testing my mental fortitude and willpower to not cave in and answer the call of the void. But finally, after an entire 10.5 minutes of falling into space, along with another 20 deaths, I finally managed to get my hands on the first couple blocks of the run. Yes! I got wood! Finally! Unfortunately, even though we finally got ourselves some blocks, our torment was not quite over, since we still had to stop ourselves from, falling up into space. So I went ahead and crafted myself a couple platforms, which did absolutely nothing to stop us from falling up since you can't actually walk on the underside of platforms. Something which may not be all that much of a problem for us right now, but will certainly be quite annoying later on when we have to fight bosses. But we'll burn that bridge when we get there. However, now that there was a platform placed on the tree, I was able to place a block underneath, or technically on top of the platform depending on which way you're looking at things, and finally ended what felt like an eternity of dying, and we can finally make some progress in the world. Right? Okay, so because it took me so long to finally get a hold on some blocks, it had already become night, and well, as you just saw, this ended up being a bit of a problem to say the very least. And while I was eventually able to kill off all the zombies and actually secure my wooden box, this ordeal took me from a starting point of 23 deaths all the way up to 34, making this by far the most painful start I've ever had in any playthrough. Anyway, now that we were finally truly safe from all the outside horrors, it was time to start gathering some resources. And while I would normally explore the surface for chests, caves, and potentially some sky islands, that was clearly off the table for this run for reasons I think are pretty self-explanatory. So with no other option, I grabbed my pickaxe and started mining, which considering that we fall upwards meant that making an elevator, well, it wasn't really possible, especially since we can't walk on the underside of platforms. However, one positive thing about mining is that there's really not much of a difference other than the fact that we have to mine upwards rather than down, since caves are just caves regardless of what gravitational orientation you're looking from, except for the fact that it was really weird seeing slimes and pots on the ceiling, along with minecart tracks, which, by the way, I did try to ride, but apparently and honestly, pretty unsurprisingly, was unable to do so. While mining, I managed to actually come across a pyramid of all things, and while the sandstorm in a bottle is widely accepted to be the best possible item to get from the chest, I was actually kind of hoping for a flying carpet since this item could potentially enable me to explore the surface of the world. And because of this, I assume that you can understand my pure excitement and joy when I saw that I had, in fact, gotten a flying carpet, and then also understand my agony when I realized that I'm just not allowed to have nice things in this world since, just like walking on the underside of platforms and riding upside down minecarts, using a flying carpet whilst upside down is just straight up not possible, and since this accessory didn't even have any modifiers, it was literally just a waste of space. Thank you, Relogic. Alright, now, I understand the video has already been playing for several minutes at this point, and I've yet to get essentially any proper progress done, but there's just a lot of smaller details from this challenge that add up over time, making this challenge as unique and difficult as it is. And I want to show as many of these details as possible. For example, on my way out of the pyramid, two slimes decided to jump me, which normally wouldn't be an issue since slimes are quite easy to deal with. However, with reverse gravity, they were very easily able to overpower me and took all my lunch money before sending me right back to spawn. And since there was no way I was going to let myself lose 12 gold to a couple of slimes, I decided to head back to get my revenge, sparking a rivalry which would take out the next 11.5 minutes of my life, along with adding 5 deaths to my running total. The reason I wanted to bring this up is not because fighting 2 slimes and getting absolutely destroyed by them 5 times is all that entertaining, but rather because it perfectly highlights the fact that even the most simple tasks, such as fighting slimes, becomes so much more difficult when the slightest things have been tweaked, throwing years of muscle memory right out the window. For example, with normal gravity, I would be able to get somewhat close to the slimes and hold them at a distance with my copper short sword, but with reverse gravity, and more specifically because I was on the ceiling, John Pythagorean theorem himself made it so that I couldn't reach the slimes at the normal distance I was accustomed to, forcing me to get closer, and in turn making me more susceptible to getting the late 90s, early 2000s Nickelodeon experience. But in a desperate attempt to keep my retention graph from plummeting further than it already has, I'm going to stop myself for now and focus more on the actual progression of the world. For example, after getting my money back, I managed to craft myself a sapphire grappling hook, which thankfully is actually functional, unlike quite literally everything else I've attempted thus far. Now that I'd gotten myself a grappling hook, I decided to make a scuffed version of a elevator, since again, we can't make a proper one, which has absolutely zero flaws in the slightest, and went perfectly without any problems, requiring me to grapple onto the wall and onto platforms in a later revised version in order to make my way up into the mines. And speaking of mines, I decided to take a bit of time and do a bit of spelunking, where I managed to find a bunch of loot such as Hermes boots, more Hermes boots, shoe spikes, another pair of shoe spikes, a flare gun, a cloud bottle, which surprisingly actually works. I'm not actually sure why I was surprised by another cloud bottle, a mace, boy I sure hope it's not another flippers, which actually made mining not all that bad, a bunch of life crystals along with a bunch of platinum, which I would later use to make a full set of armor, a platinum bow, along with a diamond staff. Also, while mining, I of course had to die at least once in a really embarrassing manner due to forgetting the whole, gravity reversal thing. Wow! What? You gotta be kidding me. That's just a scam. If I died to a dart trap, I think I would have deserved it because I'm not allowed to be on the ground normally. you know, where pressure plates are, so that would have just been really embarrassing. Lastly, to conclude our mining expedition, I managed to come across a skeleton merchant who is selling some dungy old umbrellas, which I'm not going to question why anyone would want umbrellas this far underground, and while I bought this item initially as a joke, it for some reason works completely fine. Oh, that's so good, dude. The umbrellas, okay. We are literally set to search the surface now. We've got an umbrella, grappling hook, cloud in a bottle. Like, that combination, we're never falling up into the sky again unless it's on purpose. So, having said that, I went ahead and decided to properly explore the surface of my world for the first ever time. And let me just say, it felt so liberating being able to get out of the mines and enjoy a fresh of breath air. Oh my god, it's so beautiful being able to explore the world. Oh, it took me almost 4 hours to get to the point where I can explore the surface. Like, look at this map. Look at this map, yeah? All of the map was down here pretty much. And, I mean, of course, up here when, you know, I was falling, but we don't talk about that. Oh, wait, hold up. Snow biome, snow biome. Yes, yes, yes. We can get ice, and then we can get the frost burn arrows, you know? Or we can just fall up into the... Okay. Okay, dude. So much for, never falling up into the sky again unless it was planned. So, after returning to the snow biome for a second time to collect ice for some frostburn arrows, I decided to explore the left of the world for a bit, where I came across a wooden chest containing an item I would quite literally use until the end of the run. A legendary umbrella! Oh my, I will take that, even though it's like literally no difference. I want it because it's funny. That's right, another umbrella. Anyway, with all my new gear, I finally felt that I was ready to fight the Eye of Cthulhu, though I was honestly a little bit worried about what, if anything, about this fight would change due to the reversed gravity. And there were a couple things in particular that I was rather worried about going into this fight. But first, I needed to figure out how to make my arena in the first place. Now, normally I would just make a long platform out of, well, platforms, since this would allow me to fall and attack underneath should I need to, but considering that I can't actually walk on platforms, this meant that I would need to walk on solid blocks. So I went ahead and made a long platform in the sky that I could walk on. This, of course, presents another problem that I will talk about during the fight itself, but unfortunately that fight won't happen tonight since I got a blood moon and just didn't want to take the risk. So after AFKing the entire night, I decided to take the opportunity to see if we could skip some time by sleeping in a bed, which, considering the fact that we weren't able to ride upside down minecarts nor use the flying carpet, I felt that this simply wouldn't be possible. Right? Oh my. Oh. I was not expecting that to happen. I didn't even know if I was gonna be able to sleep or not. It looks like is time increasing? I don't know if time's speeding by or not. It's hard to tell. While I wouldn't really consider this to be, well, sleeping on the bed, it did in fact speed up time, though I wouldn't be asleep for long before I was visited by your favorite man in blue who sells everything other than the items needed by you, which I am legally obligated to talk to for the very rare chance that he might sell my signature blue chicken pet. Okay, now that I'm done eating what I was eating, I can finally speak normally. I was telling myself it'd be really funny if there was a blue chicken egg in the first traveling merchant that I had in this world. And guess what? There is. I am so happy. Goodbye, eucalyptus sap. I'm not going to sell you just because. But, oh man, it's so good. I have my blue chicken already. Welcome, blue chicken. Welcome. You are going to have a very interesting time being upside down, but hello. Anyway, now that I had my trusty blue chicken by my side, I headed back to bed to sleep the day away, and when the moon started to peek under the horizon, I raised my suspicious looking eye to the ground and started the first true fight of the world. Going into this fight, there honestly wasn't much that was changed due to the reversed gravity, something I'm somewhat grateful for since I'd been worrying about this quite a bit as I'd mentioned earlier. Of course, I had to take a while to recalibrate and get accustomed to having essentially shimmer arrows, but since the Eye of Cthulhu doesn't have block collision and flies anywhere and wherever, the only other major change from this fight is that there were plenty of moments where I physically was unable to attack the boss because of our solid platform, which is actually the thing I feared the most since there is technically a time limit to this fight. Now, the reason the solid platform was going to be as big of a problem as it was is because the Eye of Cthulhu often spends a lot of time hovering above the player, and since this mechanic doesn't rely on the player's perspective, this meant that the Eye was spending a lot of time below us, which in turn meant that none of my attacks were able to deal damage for a significant portion of the fight. However, I had clearly overestimated the amount of time the Eye would spend below the arena and was able to quickly enter the second phase, which was almost completely indistinguishable from a normal playthrough. Dodging, of course, was also made more difficult throughout the entire fight, seeing as I couldn't rely on dropping downwards as I typically do to evade the onslaught of attacks, but after several minutes along with the power of spamming projectiles, we finally managed to defeat the oversized Eye, not only securing us our first victory in the world, but granting us the Shield of Cthulhu along with a bunch of Crimtane, both of which being vital items in my conquest to conquer this challenge. With the Eye of Cthulhu defeated, I set my sights on the next boss in progression, the Brain of Cthulhu. Though with essentially no upgrades to our gear other than the Tendon Bow, I knew that this fight was going to be a challenge, with my main fear once again being the inability to attack through a solid platform. Not wanting to waste any time, since again this video already had such a slow start, I rushed over to the right of the world in order to find the Crimson, and after surveying the area, I started to form a plan. Okay, so I've got an idea. Normally when I fight the Brain of Cthulhu, I do so on multiple platforms, and typically, so normally what I do is I'd have like a normal platform layer here, I made like another one here, and then I'd stand on this bottom one and jump up if needed. The problem is that I can't really do that. Even if I make a platform layer here, actually no, I don't want to make the platform layer here because I'll be standing on this side. So I have to make the platform here, but if I'm standing technically below the platform, then the brain might spawn above. So now I have a solid line to stand on, yeah? But then what I can do, also that spider, what the heck was that? But now what I can do, yeah, is I can build platforms here, and now I can't stand on them, because again, you cannot stand on the underside of platforms. But you can still grapple to them. And what I'm considering is if I should just, these stupid spiders, every single time I want to try to make a point, they have to get in the way. I might actually need to make it closer due to my inability of having proper reach. Or even what we could do is we could build a second layer of platforms, and then we can just grapple to the different layers. So yeah, okay, the plan right now is this. We have one solid line, one solid platform that we can walk on. And since we can't walk on the underside of the platforms, we're instead going to have to grapple to them and kind of just have to move around the arena this way. It's not perfect, but it's honestly the best thing that we have, since we can't really fight the Brain of Cthulhu while standing here, because on the game side, the Brain's going to try to stay above us. Hi, Editor Crispylink here. I just wanted to quickly clarify that the Brain of Cthulhu can teleport in any random direction during the fight, but from personal experience, the Brain teleports above me the most often, hence why this was such a major concern prior to the fight. That's all I wanted to say. I just wanted to make this very clear. Okay, for the record, I don't have like even the slightest hope for this fight. I just want to see what we're getting into. That way we can better prepare ourselves for when we actually do stand a chance. But anyway, yeah, let's give this a go, I guess. During the first phase of this fight, I elected to use a combination of my Tendon Bow with Jester Arrows and my Diamond Staff to take down all the creepers. And while trying to use my Scuffed Arena to dodge was in fact rather difficult, I was fortunate enough to always have the Brain and in turn the creepers to linger around the center of the arena, allowing me to pretty easily enter the second phase. Once I entered the second phase of the fight, I decided to swap out my Jester Arrows for my Frostburn Arrows to better identify the real Brain. And while this was working with some level of success, not being able to easily traverse around my arena caused me to not only get hit a bunch, but I even managed to get cornered towards the very end of the fight. However, with hardly any life keeping me alive, I managed to lock in and somehow defeated the Brain of Cthulhu against all odds. Yes! I didn't even think that we were going to stand a chance for this fight. We ended up beating him first try. That's crazy. Oh my, okay. Okay, Okay. I'm surprised how that turned out. I mean, it got close at times, but the fact that we even stood a chance, let alone beat the boss, that's crazy. I was not expecting that in the slightest. I'm sorry. How did we win that? Anyway, now that the Brain of Cthulhu was defeated, we could finally upgrade our gear prior to starting the next fight. Skeletron. So after opening our treasure bag, and also in turn getting the Brain of Confusion, I went ahead and crafted both the Magiluminescence and Deathbringer pickaxe, which might not sound like much, but with an upgraded pickaxe I returned back to my mines to finish off the Elevator. Except before I could actually do anything, I was made well aware that the goblins had decided to invade my world, and even though I hate taking out 7 mortgages to reforge a singular accessory, I figured it would still be worth it in the end. So after I slowly made my way back down to the surface, because I took the time to widen and overall improve my elevator for future use, I swiftly killed off all the goblins from the comfort of my home before heading back to hell to mine a ton of hellstone, which after mining some obsidian along with finding the goblin stinkerer, I crafted myself a full set of molten armor, molten pickaxe, molten fury, imp staff, and even a volcano for good measure. I also then went ahead and upgraded my Hermes boots to Spectre boots, which made exploring the surface of the world so much more enjoyable. However, there was no time to relax and appreciate all of our progress thus far, since I wanted to fight Skeletron tonight. And with the day already half gone, I had to quickly construct an arena comprising of a solid platform to walk on, along with a platform, which I could then grapple onto in order to loop around the boss. And once my arena was built, I waited a little bit longer for the sun to fall above the horizon before summoning Skeletron. Okay, wonderful start. An amazing start to the fight, yep. Now, even without considering that absolutely fantastic start of a fight, Skeletron was by far the most annoying boss up to this point, because even though all of these 3 past bosses, that being the Eye of Cthulhu, Brain of Cthulhu, and now Skeletron don't have block collision, Skeletron spends a lot more time hovering technically above the player than any of the other 2 bosses, spending roughly 14 seconds hiding behind my solid platform for every roughly 7 seconds he was above. And since this fight has, just like the Eye of Cthulhu, a time limit, having the boss be essentially invulnerable for 2/3 of the fight was not what I would consider ideal, especially when you have to take down both of Skeletron's hands before you can start dealing any considerable damage to the main boss in the first place. That being said, dodging Skeletron's hands wasn't all that difficult, and after exactly 3 minutes of fighting, we managed to take them both down, where I then learned that Skeletron's homing skulls not only despawn when coming in contact with solid blocks, but if there isn't a clear line of sight on the player, the skulls just won't spawn at all, allowing you to not only cheese this fight, but to stand still and regenerate a little bit of health in the process. Of course, considering what I said earlier about there being a time limit to the fight, I opted not to abuse this mechanic and instead forced Skeletron to stay above the arena by grappling onto the platform, and after spending a couple more minutes chipping away at Skeletron's health, was finally able to pulverize the calcium deficient guardian, granting us access to the dungeon. With only the wall of flesh standing in the way between us and hard mode, I knew that I was going to need to upgrade my gear one last time, and the dungeon was the perfect place to start as I was able to get myself several items such as the Blue Moon, Magic Missile along with the Shadow Key, Aqua Scepter, a slightly better Blue Moon along with the Muramasa, and since I already had the Volcano, I decided to do something I haven't done in a very long time and make myself the Knight's Edge. So after ransacking the jungle for stingers, vines, and jungle spores, I returned back to spawn to craft both the Blood Butcher along with the Blade of Grass, where I then traveled to the left in a desperate bid to find a closer Crimson. But ultimately, there was no Crimson on the left, and I had to head all the way back to the right to finally craft the Knight's Edge, which I ironically wouldn't even use against the Wall of Flesh, though found much greater use in hard mode as you'll see later on. But for now, I return back to Hell in order to start making a long platform for the Wall of Flesh, but for some reason, every time I try getting anything done in this place, the game decides to start a world event, and this time, it was a slime rain. Now, considering that I had yet to actually fight King Slime in this world, I was honestly looking forward to fighting this boss, especially since it was going to be the first boss I fought with actual collision physics. So after returning back to the surface, I proceeded to spend a couple minutes killing slimes before finally spawning in King Slime. Where was King Slime? Hello? Sir? So all of that was for nothing? I just wasted time. What the heck? I want a refund. Now, even though King Slime had vanished into thin air, the slime rain continued, and I figured it could be possible to get a second boss to spawn, since I'm pretty sure, though not 100% certain, that I've been able to fight 2 King Slimes in a single slime rain in the past. So instead of getting right back to work making my bridge, I spent the next 8 minutes desperately trying to kill enough slimes to get a second boss to spawn, only to, well, be left completely disappointed. So after lamenting over lost time, which in turn ended up wasting even more time, I mined a bunch of stone in order to expand my platform, and once I used up all my blocks, I realized I didn't actually have any money to reforge at the Goblin Stinkerer. However, after looting a couple shadow chests, I accumulated a little over 2 platinum, which I then immediately lost trying to reforge my gear. Wonderful. Anyway, after dealing with another goblin army along with a blood moon immediately afterwards, because, of course, I was finally ready to fight the Wall of Flesh.
Finally, I can fight the Wall of Flesh. It just took me a long time. The guide's still not here. I forgot about that slight detail. Whoopsies. Let me guess, all the housing's also full. I have to make more houses, don't I? Oh my god. Finally the guide's here, I can fight the Wall of Flesh. Okay, guide, I know you were only here for like 3 seconds, but, goodbye.
Going into this fight, I honestly didn't think there would be any changes caused by having reversed gravity, and while that was mostly correct, it honestly felt as though the eye lasers were aiming a little below where I actually was, as if the game thought I was standing on the other side of the platform. You know, where I would have been had I had normal gravity. Of course, this didn't mean that it was impossible to get hit by the eye lasers, since I managed to do just that quite often, but it definitely made dodging attacks much easier. In terms of actually dealing damage, I opted to use weapons with piercing due to, well, all the hungries, mainly using my Molten Fury with Jester's arrows along with my Diamond Staff, though I did occasionally swap out my Jester's arrows for Hellfire whenever I felt that I could get consistent, clear shots on the main boss in order to deal high DPS. And sure enough, I was very quickly bringing the wall's health closer and closer to 0. That was until I ran out of platforms and died literally seconds away from entering hard mode. Having gotten so close to beating the wall on my very first attempt, I immediately headed back to hell for a rematch, and just like the fight prior, I was making very quick work on the wall's health using a barrage of arrows, and also just like the previous fight, I was quickly running out of space. However, through sheer determination, and also just outright having a lot more health this time around, I managed to pull through and defeated the Wall of Flesh, officially bringing us into hard mode. Now that we've entered hard mode, not only has the game introduced a ton of new and incredibly dangerous mobs to our world, but every pre-existing mob from the early game has also been buffed significantly, meaning that I was in desperate need of upgrading my gear if I wanted to stand any chance against even the basic enemies, not to mention the many bosses that lay ahead of us. So after claiming the loot from the wall's corpse, where I managed to get both the warrior's emblem along with the breaker blade, I returned back to the surface in order to smash a bunch of crimson altars, where my world was blessed with palladium, mithril, and adamantite. From here, I proceeded to work my way through each respective ore, eventually accumulating enough adamantite to craft a full set of armor, and considering that I already had the warrior's emblem, breaker blade along with the knight's edge, which I could then later upgrade to the terra blade, I decided to lean a bit more into the melee class, though I still made myself an adamantite repeater because you can never go wrong with having a ranged weapon. Anyway, with a spiffing new set of armor, I figured it was time to reforge not only our new weapons, but any accessories I hadn't managed to reforge prior to the fight against the wall, since again, we're gonna need as much help as possible if we want to stand any chance of survival. Slight problem? I'm kind of broke. Now, had I been even remotely intelligent, I would have built a mob farm prior to fighting the wall, that way I could have a consistent cash flow right off the bat in hard mode. But since I hadn't done that, and also since I have a long history of getting bullied by cave bats and skeleton archers alike when making mob farms in hard mode, I decided to look for another source of income, when I remembered that crystal shards not only sell for quite a pretty penny, but that they generate in abundance in the underground hollow. So naturally, being the completely sane and logical person I am, I spent nearly 30 minutes farming hundreds of crystal shards, only stopping when my greed nearly took my life.
Whew, that was almost... I almost had the most embarrassing death of my career right there. Jesus Christ. I'm gonna return home before I do that again.
Anyway, after selling my crystal shards and totally not forgetting to reforge my gear, you know, the whole reason I farmed all those crystal shards in the first place, I for some reason thought it would be a good idea to fight the Old One's army to act as some sort of litmus test to see how I was performing at this stage in the game. And admittedly, this didn't really go as I hoped. During my first attempt at this event, I tried using my adamantite repeater to take down the enemies from a distance, and while this worked for the first couple waves, I inevitably ended up losing right after entering wave 4. On my second attempt, I once again started things off by using my adamantite repeater, however quickly learned that the breaker blade absolutely shreds through essentially anything in its path, quickly making my way into wave 5 and almost actually beating the event entirely. However, with far too many mobs swarming the crystal and with the dark mage at near to full health, this run too ended up going to waste. However, on my third attempt, I actually failed. It was a miserable fail, only just managed to enter the 5th wave. It was awful. Having failed the Old One's army for a third time now, I decided to take a short break and reassess my gear, where I realized that it would probably be in my best interest to get the Golden Shower, not only for this event, but just in general, since being able to inflict the Ichor debuff would be incredibly useful for the vast majority of mobs and bosses moving forward. And since I already had purchased the Spell Tome from the wizard earlier, all I needed now was a little bit of Ichor along with some Souls of Night. And I probably would have been able to get all these items in a single trip if it weren't for those meddling fire-breathing kids who decided to aggro a random Crimson Mimic. Well, technically I actually died to an Ichor sticker, but that wouldn't have happened if I wasn't preoccupied with the Mimic. Thank you, Jonathan. Regardless, after getting the last couple souls I needed, along with permanently borrowing a couple books from the dungeon, I not only crafted myself the Golden Shower, but also bought the Lightning Aura Staff with the 5 Defender medals I had managed to obtain, and finally felt that I was ready to beat the Old One's army.
Okay, so I may have failed the Old One's army, but I still beat the Dark Mage. So that's cool.
Now, even though I managed to kill the Dark Mage, I hadn't actually completed the event, and at this point, the sunk cost fallacy had already taken complete control over me, and there was no way I was going to stop now when I knew that I was more than capable of beating the event. So with my last Eternia Crystal, I started at the 5th and final event, where after working my way back up to wave 5, I finally managed to defeat the Dark Mage, securing my victory over this event once and for all. And no, I never used those Defender medals, nor did I ever touch the Old One's army for the remainder of this run. Having finally beaten the Old One's army, I was finally ready to start preparing for the mech bosses, but the game had other ideas as it decided that now would be the perfect time to start a slime rain. And while I really do truly hate postponing making more progress in this world, trust me, my retention graph will speak for me as well, I still hadn't forgotten my previous run-in with King Slime, or rather the lack thereof, and wanted to prove that I truly am better than this gelatinous coward. So after heading my way back down to my arena, I killed a bunch of slimes in order to spawn King Slime. And as much as I wish there was some crazy, insane climax of this fight that would make this ordeal exciting or interesting in any way, shape, or form, King Slime simply just crumbled the moment he saw my loadout. So, back to preparing for mech bosses, I guess. Now, when it comes to the mech bosses in any normal, or at least any playthrough that isn't this one, since I'm not really known for doing normal playthroughs of this game, I would normally get myself the Daedalus Stormbow from Hollow Mimics along with Holy Arrows in order to kill the Destroyer 2 to 3 times so that I can craft myself a full set of hollowed armor along with a hollowed repeater, where I would then fight the twins and Skeletron Prime. However, since my solid platform of an arena would prevent the Daedalus Stormbow from attacking the Destroyer, I opted to fight this boss last after getting better weapons from the other 2 mechs. And while I couldn't decide which boss to fight first, the game actually ended up deciding for me, albeit not letting me fully prepare ahead of time. Considering I'd still yet to reforge my gear, I knew that this premature fight with the twins was inevitably going to fail, but considering that the boss AI sometimes gets a little wacky with reverse gravity, I figured that this would be the perfect opportunity to learn how this boss behaves, and it's a good thing I took on this fight because I was not expecting the fact that Retinazer would perpetually sit below the platform, making it physically impossible for any of my normal attacks to deal any damage except for the couple seconds during the dash attack. Now, even though I did in fact end up dying almost instantly during this fight, I started to form a plan as to how I would be able to defeat this boss. And the first step? Get the Rod of Discord. For those of you who don't know, the Rod of Discord is an extraordinarily rare item with a 1 in 500 chance to drop from Chaos Elementals, which, considering that Chaos Elementals themselves are rather uncommon to come across, makes getting the Rod of Discord incredibly annoying and tedious to get. However, considering that I'd been spending a lot of time farming crystal shards in the underground hollow, I figured that I would inevitably get this item passively while farming for money, and since I could then spend that money on reforging my gear, I could essentially kill 2 stones with 1 bird. However, after spending 20 minutes slowly losing my mind, I eventually caved in and decided to do the one thing I promised myself I wouldn't do and started working on a mob farm, taking me not only an entire hour to complete, which alone was very sanity draining, but dying 11 times in the process, pushing me to insanity.
Haha, get it? Crispylink was burned to a crisp.
Thankfully, if just for my own sake, getting the Rod of Discord didn't even take all that long, all things considered, taking me just a little over 100 kills to get, even managing to get this item before finishing the mob farm, which admittedly was a little bittersweet since I never actually ended up using the farm, but hey, I'll gladly take that over having to farm Chaos Elementals for several hours on end. Anyway, now that we have the Rod of Discord, you may be wondering why I decided to grind for this item in the first place. And the whole reason for getting this item is because of the fact that I can't walk on the underside of platforms, even if I hammer them, a comment I receive quite often on part 1 of this challenge. And since I can't walk on platforms, up until now, my arena has been restricted to only a singular line of solid blocks, which in turn makes dodging bosses incredibly difficult. However, now that I have the Rod of Discord, I was able to build a second platform to the arena, which allowed me the ability to teleport between the two, which in theory should make dodging bosses much easier. So when day turned into night, I returned back to the arena to fight the twins once more, where things were actually looking pretty good, and I was actually able to dodge a lot better than the previous attempt. That was of course until I took 200 fall damage, where things quickly spiraled downhill. After such an embarrassing fail, I finally decided to upgrade and reforge my gear. So after finding an Anklet of the Wind, along with killing 2 wyverns, I crafted myself a pair of lightning boots along with some angel wings. But once I inevitably ran out of money while reforging, I decided to search for the shimmer in order to commit the equivalent of tax fraud in Terraria, aka shimmer reforging. However, finding the shimmer, well, it ended up taking me an entire 35 minutes to find, and even still I somehow found myself going into debt. Now that my gear was more or less reforged, I returned back to the arena to fight the twins yet again. And yet again, I found myself dying right after bringing Spasmatism into the second phase. And at this point, I was feeling rather discouraged, having failed this boss 3 times now. But going into the 4th attempt, I refused to lose. Literally not even close. I don't know what happened, but I just locked in right there. Dude, I was so concentrated. That's crazy. Oh my. Having had something finally click, I managed to not only defeat the twins, but to absolutely destroy them, even going as far as beating this boss a second time, allowing me to craft a full set of hollowed armor. However, I didn't quite have enough of hollowed bars to make a repeater, and honestly just didn't really care enough to fight the twins again just to get the slight upgrade. But what I did care about was fish! Or more specifically, potions. So after fishing up some prismite and armored cavefish, along with making a small plant farm, I crafted myself a ton of potions and made my way back up to the arena where, after making a couple renovations, was finally ready to fight Skeletron Prime. Considering that the Skeletron Prime fight is somewhat reminiscent of the Skeletron fight, for reasons I think should be pretty self-explanatory for rather obvious reasons, I was honestly feeling rather confident about this fight. Normally when fighting Skeletron Prime, I would target the laser arm since this arm alone is directly responsible for the majority of my failed runs. However, just like the Wall of Flesh, the lasers were incredibly inaccurate, so instead of wasting my time taking down the limbs, I decided to just target the main boss itself. Now, despite the twins having been an actual challenge and requiring multiple attempts to beat, Skeletron Prime was honestly kind of a letdown, I'm not gonna lie, since I not only managed to defeat this boss on my first attempt, but managed to do so while taking essentially 0 damage whatsoever, not even going below half health once. But anyway, with 2 mech bosses defeated, only the Destroyer remained, and despite having put this fight off for some time now, I still didn't know what weapon I should use, so I decided to take a look at the Terraria wiki where a certain unexpected weapon caught my attention. The flamethrower. Now, I'll be honest for a quick second, I'm not even sure if I've ever even used the flamethrower in the first place, and if I have, it's been so long that I've completely forgotten. However, this item got my attention for multiple reasons. First of all, the flamethrower is acquired post-Skeletron Prime, which means it's specifically engineered for the stage of the game that we're currently in. And plus, the weapon itself looks quite promising, having decent damage, firing multiple attacks per use, piercing 3 enemies, along with ignoring 15 points of enemy defense, making it a perfect candidate against the Destroyer. Slight problem though, the flamethrower uses gel as ammunition, and, well, I don't really have any gel. What I do have, however, is a slime statue, so after hooking a timer to the slime statue, I went AFK to go get some food, and by the time I came back, I had nearly 6,400 gel along with a slime staff, and while the latter was completely useless, it was still pretty cool. Speaking of gel, while I was trying to sleep the day away in order to finally fight the Destroyer, the game decided to demonstrate its cruel yet somewhat amusing sense of humor by starting a slime rain. You know, now that I had more gel than I would ever need. Regardless, the game presented me an opportunity to test out my new weapon, and I gladly took advantage of this, absolutely shredding King Slime, and totally not falling up into space in the process. But anyway, once King Slime was disposed of, and when day turned into night, I returned back to the arena in order to face my fears and finally fight the Destroyer once and for all. Considering that we now have ourselves a pair of wings, staying close enough to the Destroyer to deal damage was honestly no longer a problem, something I felt was going to be a genuine issue when I first entered hard mode, since falling up, or rather the act of falling up and not the jump scratch level, seems to be the #1 favorite pastime of this challenge. And since the flamethrower itself is able to pierce through multiple mobs, I was not only able to consistently get well over 1000 DPS, but was also able to eviscerate all the probes effortlessly. And without the probes, I was able to focus my firepower, in this case quite literally, directly into the main boss itself, bringing the Destroyer's health lower, and lower, and lower still, until finally the oil-stained corpse of what was came crashing up to the ground above. And yes, there were several casualties in terms of the NPCs, but that was a sacrifice I was willing to make. Having defeated all 3 mech bosses, I was finally able to make myself the pickaxe axe in order to make more progress in my mission of beating this challenge. However, the game being as callous and merciless as it is, decided to start a solar eclipse on that very day, where I learned first-handed that I was in desperate need of upgrading my gear, and since I talked a lot earlier about leaning more so into the melee class, I decided to shimmer my flamethrower in order to craft the True Knight's Edge, which, I'm gonna be honest, wasn't really all that good on its own. Considering that I was still very obviously in need of upgrading the rest of my gear, since upgrading my sword alone wasn't going to cut it, I decided to make a graveyard biome so that I could purchase corrupt seeds from the Dryad in order to eventually fight the Eater of Worlds, since getting a 17% reduction in damage taken would be absolutely massive moving forward. But while the corrupt grass was slowly spreading, I returned back to the jungle in order to farm a ton of chlorophyte along with gathering some life fruit. And once I eventually returned home on my own accord, and definitely not because I accidentally teleported directly on top of a giant tortoise, I crafted myself the Excalibur, which I immediately upgraded into the True Excalibur. However, now that the artificial corruption had spread quite a bit, I farmed enough rotten chunks and vile mushrooms to craft some worm food. And considering this boss is normally meant to be fought with pre-hard mode gear, I was able to absolutely shred through this boss with complete ease. Anyway, after getting the worm scarf, I decided to farm several brains and eyes of Cthulhu respectively in order to make enough money to reforge our gear. And once that was all taken care of, I made my way back to the jungle, not only to make an arena for the Plantera fight, but to finally get max life, thankfully managing to avoid teleporting directly on top of a random tortoise this time. But now that we were at full health and an inventory full of potions, I chucked down a stick of dynamite in order to summon Plantera. But what I didn't realize at the moment was I made a crucial oversight. You see, going into the Plantera fight, I was feeling rather confident since this is one of those boss fights I wasn't expecting to be changed much if at all due to reversed gravity. And to be fair, I wasn't wrong about these assumptions, but the oversight I made wasn't necessarily about the boss itself, but rather the arena, since the entire right side was crimson. And for those of you who've never made the mistake of fighting Plantera outside of the underground jungle, keep it that way, since Plantera will charge at you like a pitbull that just spotted an unsupervised child. Having realized my mistake, I desperately tried to keep Plantera on the left side of the arena, and actually managed to enter the second phase. But considering that things were getting rather cramped, and I needed a lot more room to dodge all the tendrils, I decided to take the risk and use the whole arena, where I, unsurprisingly, ended up getting torn to shreds. Knowing I needed to get rid of the Crimson if I wanted any chance to beat this boss, I decided to buy myself a Clantaminator from the Steampunk, but since I forgot to put away all my money before fighting Plantera, I ended up losing every cent to my name. So after being forced to farm several mimics to regain my lost cash, I was finally able to purify the arena, and when I summoned Plantera for the second time, the difference was as noticeable as night and day. so long as you don't live on either the North or South Pole, of course. Finally, having access to my whole arena, I was able to enter the second phase without any issue, and other than a couple instances where I needed to use a Rod of Discord to prevent myself from getting cornered, this fight as a whole went along quite smoothly, albeit taking its sweet time, taking just shy of 5.5 minutes for Plant Terra to wilt away into a pile of organic mush. Considering that I had already found the Lizard Temple earlier, and since I was still currently in the jungle, I decided to immediately rush the temple, where I was pleasantly surprised by how much easier it was to navigate the rust-ridden corridors without the fear of activating the many traps scattered across the floor. And once I entered the golem spawning chambers in a record pace of 1 minute 20 seconds, I immediately started building a platform so that I could more easily reach this boss, since Golem is one of the few bosses whose fight is considerably affected by reversed gravity. However, right as I was about to summon Golem, I remembered that since Plant Terra was now defeated, I could finally get a broken hero sword, which I could then in turn use to craft the Terror Blade. So after returning home, I started a solar eclipse in a desperate bid to get this item. Though, unfortunately, due to what's colloquially known as a skill issue, I wasn't able to get this item in the first solar eclipse, since of the 3 Mothrons that managed to spawn, I was only able to successfully kill the third, where I was rewarded not with the broken hero sword, but rather the Eye of Cthulhu yo-yo. Going into the second solar eclipse, I didn't have much better luck, killing the first Mothron that spawned, granting me yet another yo-yo, but dying to 3 of the other Mothrons that managed to spawn during this event, the last of which being the closest thing resembling a jump scare I've ever encountered in this game. Well, technically there was a 5th Mothron that spawned during the solar eclipse, but it ended up running away once the event came to an end. Getting quite flustered at this point, I once again started yet another solar eclipse, and miraculously I actually managed to get the broken hero sword on the first Mothron of the event, not only crafting myself the Terror Blade, but managing to reforge it to legendary despite not having had much money to start with. And at this point, it felt as though my luck was improving. So much so, in fact, that it felt more as an insult than anything else, since I managed to kill an additional 2 Mothrons, with both of them dropping the hero sword after I already got the Terror Blade. You know, now that I didn't need them. Anyway, now that we have the Terror Blade in our arsenal, I returned back to the jungle temple to finally summon Golem, where I quickly realized that the platform I'd constructed earlier was more so of a hazard to us than anything else, and considering the potential danger this platform was causing, I decided to destroy it in the middle of the fight, which, while yes was rather sketchy, was the best course of action I could have made in the moment. Without the platform in the way, it became so much easier to dodge Golem's attacks, especially since I didn't have to worry about coming into physical contact with the main boss itself, quickly taking down both of Golem's hands. However, while I suspected that the first stage of this fight would be relatively easy, I was pretty worried about what would happen once Golem's head detached from his body, since it was very much entirely possible that the head would constantly get in our way, making this fight incredibly difficult. And once the head popped off and made its way to the ceiling, it looked like it was, in fact, going to make the safety of the ceiling no more. But after a couple seconds, continued to rise into the lizard bricks, causing a wave of relief to wash over me. With the main threat averted, and with Golem's health as low as it already was, I decided to put this prehistoric fossil out of its misery, whereupon opening the treasure bag was rewarded with absolutely hot garbage, and considering that I wanted to get either the Pixaw or potentially even the Sunstone in order to craft the Celestial Shell, I decided to fight this boss twice more, where I decided to call it quits while I was still ahead and safely returned back to spawn without as much as a scratch. And when I opened my 2 bags, I was taken aback by the fact that I managed to get not just 1 Pixaw, not just 2 Pixaws, but to have also gotten the Sunstone, something you will not catch me complaining about. Anyway, since I also managed to accumulate 60 plus beetle husks from these fights and felt it rude to let them go to waste, and also because I was in Hollowed armor still, I decided it would only make sense to go and craft myself some beetle armor. However, in order to actually make beetle armor, you first need a full set of turtle armor. And while I had gotten a turtle shell earlier when making the Plant Terra arena, I specifically remember having sold it to the Goblin Stinkerer, and after searching all my chests multiple times each, just to make sure I hadn't, I reluctantly accepted that I had to farm 3 whole new shells, which, despite getting the first shell in only a matter of minutes, ended up costing me nearly an entire hour along with all my remaining sanity. But you know what doesn't cost you an hour of your time nor your sanity, or at least I hope not. That's right, subscribing to the channel. Now, considering the fact that you made it this far into the video, I think it's rather safe to assume that you like this kind of content, and by subscribing, and more specifically turning on the notification bell, you'll not only be notified whenever I post more videos like this, but you'll also make this sad soul very happy in the process, since I'm trying to reach 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and every subscriber brings me just that much closer to my goal. But anyway, enough self-promoting. I believe that was the 3rd and final turtle shell, so it's finally time to go back to spawn, and
Okay, I quick sacked it. I had a turtle shell still. I thought I sold it. I didn't know that I had the first one still. So I could have. Okay.
Okay, so I just wasted a bunch of time. Wonderful, wonderful. Glad to hear. So, yeah, apparently I hadn't actually sold the turtle shell, and despite having searched my chests multiple times, managed to completely overlook it. So, in the end, I just ended up wasting a bunch of time getting an item I didn't even need since I already had it. Now, since I can't change the past, I decided to stop dwelling on my honest mistake and crafted the full set of turtle armor, and from there upgraded it into beetle armor. However, the grind doesn't end there, since at this point I'd gathered 3 of the 4 items to craft the celestial shell, with only the moon charm remaining, and since the moon charm can only be obtained during a full moon, I waited, and waited, and waited a bit longer before finally getting a full moon, where I very quickly and painlessly managed to... I'm only joking. It actually ended up taking me an entire 2 full moons before I managed to get the moon charm, meaning that it took me an entire 2 hours just to get these 2 upgrades, that being the armor and the charm. You know, I've already said it multiple times now, but I think I'm genuinely going insane at this point. Anyway, after finally crafting ourselves a celestial shell, it was time to start getting serious, since at this point there was only 2 more bosses along with 1 more event standing in between us and completing this challenge once and for all, the first of which being the lunatic cultist. Now, considering that the lunatic cultist always tries to stay above the player, I knew that this fight was going to be rather annoying at best and outright difficult at worst, but by no means impossible, especially considering that we have a Rod of Discord. But my main fear wasn't necessarily what I did know, but rather what I didn't, since I wasn't sure if and which of this boss's attacks can phase through solid blocks, something that would give an inherent edge to the lunatic cultist considering that our weapons can't attack through solid blocks. And again, solid platform. But anyway, once at the dungeon, I figured it would be best to expand upon our Skeletron arena instead of making a new one entirely by making a second layer, and looking back at the footage, I kind of wish I made the gap between platforms a little bit greater, especially since we now have wings. But once that was all said and done, it was time to drink the Soul Iron Skin potion I had on me at the time, and start the second to final fight of the world. Once the fight began, I started to immediately pay attention to the cultist attacks, noticing that while the Ice Mist attack could travel through our solid platform, both the Fireball and Lightning Orb attacks could not. However, since the Fireball attack does have an AoE effect, it was still best to not be directly atop of the platform for this part of the cycle. And while it was rather annoying having to teleport below the arena for the ancient ritual, sometimes having to bite the bullet and take some extra damage by teleporting before the cooldown reset, I was able to enter the second phase quite quickly. Now that we were in the second phase, the Lunatic Cultist adds 2 new attacks, the Ancient Lights attack, which can travel through solid blocks, along with the Ancient Dooms, which while not able to pass through blocks, were consistently spawning in areas that very well could have dealt damage to us if it weren't for my epic dodging skills, and definitely not because I was just really lucky whilst paying literally no attention to this attack whatsoever, despite the incredibly high damage these projectiles can deal. Now, despite having only consumed an Iron Skin potion prior to starting this fight, Lunatic Cultist was surprisingly easy, and we managed to take on this boss with close to full health, starting everyone's favorite stage of the game, the Lunar Events. Since the Stardust Pillar had spawned directly on top of the dungeon, I figured I may as well take down this pillar while I was still here, and despite getting extremely low on health at one point in the fight, I never actually ended up dying, though I did somehow manage to fall up into space not once, but twice. Anyway, once the Stardust Pillar came crumbling down, or rather kind of just faded out of existence, I went ahead and crafted the Stardust Dragon Staff before heading over to the Solar Pillar, and while I hate Nebula more than any other pillar, Solar is a pretty close second. While at the Solar Pillar, my main threats were the many Crawltipedes, since again, we tend to fall up into the sky, as demonstrated with the previous pillar, but also the Selenians, aka Fire Sonic. And again, somehow despite getting extremely low on several occasions, I managed to take down this pillar without dying once. Okay, listen, that death was after the pillar had already died, so it doesn't count. Now that the Solar Pillar was disposed of, I decided to finally tackle the Nebula Pillar, and let me just tell you, this pillar was painful. Now, normally I struggle on this pillar as it is without reverse gravity due to a whole assortment of factors, including Evolution Beast and their homing nebula spheres that can travel through blocks, but mainly the nebula floaters since they not only love to spam their lasers, but because they constantly teleport all over the place, making dodging so much more annoying and having me constantly losing focus as to where is safe and where I need to attack. However, with reversed gravity, I had to not only worry about dodging all these projectiles along with keeping track of all the enemies, but I also had to prevent myself from falling up into the cosmos, and with so much I was trying to keep track of all at once, I may or may not have slipped up on several occasions, leading to my demise multiple times. But eventually, despite my struggles, this pillar too was defeated, leaving only the Vortex Pillar standing between us and Moonlord. Now, before we go and fight the Vortex Pillar, there's a couple things I wanted to take care of, the first of which being our arena. Now, since we already have a pretty decent arena back at spawn, I decided to reuse it for the final fight, though felt that it would need to be expanded or at least opened up a bit more, considering that I was most certainly going to be flying around a lot in order to dodge all of Moonlord's attacks. So after expanding the top platform, removing part of the bottom platform, along with adding a third layer to the arena entirely, I felt that this space would be plenty enough for proper mobility. And again, if it wasn't, I always had the Rod of Discord at my disposal. Lastly, I wanted to make sure that we had all the potions that we needed, and while we had quite the impressive collection, there were a couple that I didn't have and quickly did some fishing to get them. But now that the arena was improved and our potions gathered, I made my way back over to the Vortex Pillar where, after being brought extremely close to dying along with totally not falling back up into space, I managed to take down the final pillar, returning back to our arena for the so-called impending doom. Going into this fight, I was especially nervous, and for good reason too. Not only was this the final boss of a challenge I've been spending a lot of time working on over the course of the past month, but because this boss has so many attacks and specific mob AI mechanics that it was all but guaranteed that something would be changed when playing with reversed gravity, and there were a couple things that I noticed. First of all, since Moonlord, much like the lunatic cultist, tries to stay above the player at all times, I found that whenever I was standing on the solid platform, Moonlord's top eye was completely obstructed from my attacks, though admittedly this was one of the least problematic features during this fight since I was almost always flying around the arena in the first place, causing me to have a clear line of sight on the top eye. However, despite this, the top eye was still a major problem during this fight, or more specifically, the Phantasmal Death Ray. Now, typically during the Phantasmal Death Ray attack, I would simply fly over Moonlord to evade this beam of celestial energy. However, with reversed gravity, I really couldn't do that since flying up was actually flying down, and while I did try to fall under Moonlord to not get hit, the player's falling speed is much lower than flying, causing me to get hit a couple times during this attack, along with having to rely on the Rod of Discord, an item I honestly didn't want to use all that often due to how overpowered it truly is. Also, something else I noticed during this fight, and is completely unrelated to having reversed gravity, was I kept on dashing into the Moonclots during Moonlord's leech ability, something that even if I managed to avoid taking damage, still threw me off guard and forced me to recalibrate in the middle of a war zone. And despite all of these forces working against me, I managed to take down the top eye, right eye, and eventually even the left eye, but right as I exposed Moonlord's core, I died. As annoyed as I was having lost this fight, I decided to reflect on what went wrong in preparation for an inevitable rematch, where after making a fishing pond in the corruption in order to make wrath potions, decided it would be best to get the coveted Master Ninja gear to prevent ourselves from getting caught on the Moonclots. And while making the wrath potions was quite easy to do, the Master Ninja gear, oh boy, I have a story for you. Okay, so in order to craft the Master Ninja gear, you need 4 items: climbing claws, shoe spikes, a black belt along with a tabby, and for no particular reason, I decided to get the dungeon items first. Now, both the black belt and tabby have a 15.97% chance to drop from Bone Lees in Master Mode, and while I kept on getting black belts, I was just seemingly unable to get myself a tabby, eventually getting one after a whopping 30 minutes. However, when I was looking back through my footage while editing this video, I only just realized that I had actually gotten a tabby on my very first kill of this trip, and had I noticed this, I would have been in and out of the dungeon in a solid 10 minutes flat. However, the story doesn't quite end there, since I still needed to get a pair of climbing claws as I'd already gotten a pair of shoe spikes earlier in the run. Now, there are 3 ways of getting climbing claws in Terraria: finding them in surface chests, wooden crates, and buying them from skeleton merchants during a waxing crescent. And while I originally opted to get this item from fishing, I got bored after a measly 10 minutes and decided to wait for a skeleton merchant to sell them. Now, since it was currently a waxing crescent and I needed a waning crescent to buy the claws, I figured that sleeping for only 2 nights wouldn't be the end of the world. But once 2 nights came and went, I realized just how much of an idiot I was, since waxing not only means that the moon is becoming more visible, having to wait 6 nights instead of 2 for it to become a waning crescent, but that I actually needed it to be a waxing crescent all along, meaning that I slept past the moon phase that I needed and now had to sleep for an entire moon cycle, which if I were able to sleep unimpeded with time passing by at 5x speed the entire time, would take a little over 30 minutes. But since the game just really hates me, I ended up getting a blood moon which prevented me from sleeping the night away, and I could have had to wait for even longer since I also ended up getting a solar eclipse, though thankfully the moon phase changes at the start of every day and just so happened to become a waxing crescent at the same time as this event. Now, even though I was incredibly flustered at this point, there was one redeeming factor, and that was the fact that I managed to craft the Master Ninja gear already reforged warding.
Bam. And it's warding already. I will gladly take that. Thank you. It almost pays back for all the pain and suffering of sleeping for an entire week straight.
Emphasis on almost, I still want a refund. But anyway, having made all of the upgrades I wanted to our gear, I crafted a celestial sigil, and all I needed to do now was wait for the solar eclipse to come to an end. Never mind, guess I'll just have to wait for it to become day then.
What do you mean another solar eclipse? Why? No. I just want to fight Moonlord. Please.
But finally, after the solar eclipse came to an end, it was truly, finally time to bring an end to this challenge once and for all.
I've been watching you. Just come to me.
And with that, we finally managed to defeat not only the Moonlord, but this challenge as a whole. And honestly, this has been a super fun project to work on, and it's been amazing to see all the support that you've all shown me from part 1. I wasn't expecting that video to perform remotely as well as it had, but I just want to quickly say thank you. Thank you for watching these videos, and thank you for sticking around for the entire journey. I have a lot more in plan for future videos, so I hope you'll continue to stick around to see what I make next. But that is going to be all for today. Thank you again so very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.